Christians talk an awful lot about God forgiving sins and God being loving. And, a lot of people don't really object to that until we start talking about how Jesus died for your sins. And that gives a lot of people some pause. Because we go on to say things like, Jesus died in your place. He took what you deserve. Or God poured out on him all of the penalty and pain that your sin deserves. And that's where a lot of people get hung up, because they start to wonder, like, yeah, okay, God is a forgiving God. That's great. But why in the world is God so seemingly angry and wrathful and even mean that he has to pour that out on Jesus, let alone anybody? I mean, why is it that God can't just let it go? Because after all, that's what I do, right? When I forgive people, I don't make them pay for it. And I don't go after them. I just let it go. Why can't God let it go? Why does anybody have to bear any cost? Isn't that different than forgiveness? And look, where I think that comes from is a good place and a good concern, that question. And in some ways it makes sense. But where I think it stems from, the more that I think about it, is from a misunderstanding of what the process of forgiveness is actually like. You see, a lot of times we don't notice the cost on us of forgiving somebody else because the things that we're most often forgiving are so small that we don't actually notice what it takes out of us. The truth is that I don't think anybody ever forgives anybody without something having to be paid, ever. I was at a leadership conference a couple years back. I believe it was a Willow Creek Leadership Summit, and one of the speakers they invited was an actor by the name of Tyler Perry. You may have heard of him before, but what you probably don't know about him was that he grew up in an exceptionally abusive home. And he endured emotional and physical abuse, and he was taken advantage of by his father as well as several other adults in his life. And the burden of pain was massive. But quite famously, he decided to forgive his father. And so the interviewer on stage says, man, it's amazing that you forgave. That's quite admirable. And Tyler says something that a lot of us would find predictable at first. He said, yeah, when I forgave, I found that I was unburdened. And we go, yeah, that's why you forgive, because you don't want it to eat at you either. But then the next part was very interesting, and I think revealed a lot about the process of what forgiveness is actually like. The interviewer asked him, and what was that like for you, Tyler, to have to do that? And he took a deep breath and he said, the interesting and difficult thing about forgiveness is that it took as much energy and pain for me to let go of my right to bitterness and revenge as it did to endure the initial wrong in the first place. He said, forgiveness has a massive cost. And that makes sense, see, because that explains why so many people struggle with it. It's not because it's so easy and you just ever let anything go. It's because either they have to pay for what they did to you, or you are going to pay massively, emotionally and otherwise, to be able to let it go. It always has a cost. This is why there's a survey that has been done year over year by actually several different sources, asking Christians about all the Christian practices that the Bible requires them to do. And it lists probably something like 50 some of them. And it asks Christians to rank them in order from the ones they do the best with to the ones they struggle with the most. And consistently in every struggle, or in every study, and every year, forgiveness ranks in the lower 3 in terms of how good people think they are with it. And that's not because you ever just let something go. It's because there's always a cost. This is why Jesus had to die on the cross. Not because God is different than us, or angrier than us, or more wrathful than us, but because we were made in his likeness with the same needs for justice as God has, but his is so much greater and so much more perfect. And so what it looks like for God to have to endure the letting go of this, it takes from him the exact same amount of pain and energy as it would actually cost to endure the initial wrong from all of humanity in the first place. All of humanity's sins poured onto one human being who is also God. Jesus Christ went to the cross, and instead of punishing you and me, he said, I want to let this go, but this is what it's going to have to take. This is what it takes to satisfy my need for justice, and this is what it's going to have to take to let it go. So on that cross, he endured not only death, He endured not only a sociological coming apart of public shame, but he endured hell itself, a total separation from God the Father. And so you see, in order to forgive us, God does, frankly, on a much bigger and grander scale, something very similar to what you and I have to do all the time. Except for we would never pay such a massive cost to be reconciled with anyone. But luckily for us, as much as God's need for justice and his desire for justice is perfect and greater than ours, his love is perfect and greater than ours too. And so Jesus went to the cross, having no limits on the level of cost he was willing to bear on himself to pay the price to get back in relationship with us. And so the question this leads you with is this: are you willing to accept that forgiveness? Are you willing to say to God, I need that forgiveness? Or are you going to insist that either there's not really a problem between you and God, or say you don't really want God in your life, or insist on paying it off yourself? Because these are really only the options. Either we are going to bear the cost or God is. But the good news is he very much wants to let it go, very much wants to pay the cost for you. And it does not take you being good enough. It only takes you being willing to approach him and just admit your need and trust him that he's willing to take that on himself, and trust that being reconciled with him as a God and as a king is better than anything else that you're leaving behind.